The coffee burned my tongue as Sarah Mitchell's laughter echoed through the break room at St. Mary's Hospital. I had just introduced myself as the new intern in their emergency response training program, and apparently, my youthful appearance was absolutely hilarious to the HR supervisor and her clique. The taste of cheap hospital coffee mixed with humiliation as Sarah wiped tears from her eyes, still giggling like a high school mean girl who never grew up. "Are you sure you're old enough to work here, sweetie?" Sarah asked, her voice dripping with condescension as she adjusted her perfectly styled blonde hair. The other HR staff members snickered behind their clipboards, creating a chorus of mockery that made my cheeks burn with embarrassment. I was 24 years old, fresh out of Northwestern University with a degree in healthcare administration and more certifications than half the people in that room combined. But standing there in my crisp white button-down and black slacks, holding my folder of credentials like a shield, I apparently looked like someone's kid sister who had wandered into the wrong building. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed incessantly, casting harsh shadows that made everyone's faces look sickly pale, which seemed fitting for the toxic atmosphere Sarah had created. I have all my certifications current, including BLS, ACLS, and PALS, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady as I set my coffee cup down on the scratched formica table. The sound echoed in the sterile break room, where motivational posters about teamwork and excellence hung mockingly on beige walls that had seen better decades. Sarah's expression shifted from amusement to something darker, more calculating. She snatched my folder before I could react, flipping through my certifications with theatrical disbelief. Her manicured nails clicked against the plastic sleeves as she examined each document, her eyebrows raising in exaggerated surprise that felt more like performance art than genuine reaction. "Well, would you look at that, girls?" she announced to her audience of administrative assistants and junior HR staff. "Little Miss Perfect here thinks she's ready to handle real emergencies. I bet she's never even seen blood outside of a training video." The room filled with more laughter, but this time it had an edge to it, like broken glass scraping against concrete. Maria Gonzalez, one of the newer HR assistants, looked uncomfortable and avoided eye contact, but the others seemed to be enjoying the show. I could smell Sarah's overwhelming perfume mixed with the antiseptic hospital smell that permeated everything in this building, creating a nauseating combination that made my stomach churn. "Actually, I worked as an EMT during college," I said, my voice gaining strength as I found my footing. "I've handled trauma cases, cardiac arrests, and multiple casualty incidents." My supervisor said I was one of the most competent trainees he'd ever worked with. The laughter died abruptly, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Sarah's smile faltered for just a moment before she plastered it back on, but I caught the flash of something ugly in her eyes. It wasn't just disbelief or skepticism, it was genuine hostility, as if my competence was a personal insult to her authority. "Well, aren't you just a little superhero?" she said, her voice now cold as the November wind rattling the windows. "Too bad real hospital emergencies aren't like your little college ambulance rides. This is St. Mary's, not some community college training exercise." The other staff members shifted uncomfortably in their plastic chairs, sensing the tension escalating beyond casual workplace hazing. I could hear the distant sounds of the hospital beyond these walls, the constant beeping of monitors, the shuffle of nurses' shoes on linoleum, the occasional overhead page calling doctors to various departments. This was supposed to be my introduction to the team, but it felt more like a hostile interrogation. "Let's see how our little EMT handles the mandatory training scenarios," Sarah continued, standing up and smoothing her pencil skirt. "Everyone to training room B. We're starting with basic life support, though I'm sure our expert here already knows everything." The sarcasm in her voice was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. As we filed out of the break room, I noticed how the other staff members fell into line behind Sarah like obedient soldiers following their general into battle. The hallway stretched before us, lined with motivational banners about patient care and safety, their bright colors a stark contrast to the institutional gray walls. Training room smelled like disinfectant and fierce sweat, with CPR mannequins arranged in neat rows like plastic corpses waiting for resurrection. Sarah positioned herself at the front of the room like a professor preparing to humiliate a student, her arms crossed and her expression smugly expectant. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, creating an unsettling strobe effect that made everyone look like characters in a horror movie. "All right, newbie," Sarah announced, gesturing toward the nearest mannequin with the dramatic flair of a game show host revealing a prize. "Show us how it's done. And remember, this isn't some small-town emergency where you can improvise. We follow strict protocols here." I approached the mannequin, my hand steady despite the hostile audience. The plastic face stared up at me with empty eyes, its chest rising and falling in mechanical rhythm. I could feel everyone watching, waiting for me to make a mistake they could mock for weeks to come. But my training kicked in, muscle memory taking over as I positioned my hands and began compressions. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. Check pulse. Continue. The rhythm was as familiar as my own heartbeat, each movement precise and confident. I could hear Sarah muttering something to one of her cronies, probably criticizing my technique or questioning my form. But I blocked out the noise and focused on the task, letting my experience guide me through the scenario. "Time," Sarah called out after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. "Not terrible, I suppose, though your hand placement could use work. And you're compressing too hard. You'd probably break every rib in a real patient." The criticism stung because I knew it wasn't true. My form was textbook perfect, my compressions exactly the right depth and rate. But challenging Sarah's expertise in front of her staff would only make things worse, so I bit my tongue and nodded as if accepting her feedback. The taste of injustice was bitter as hospital coffee. "Let's move on to the next scenario," Sarah continued, her confidence growing with each put down. "Choking victim. And this time, try to remember that we're dealing with real human beings here, not training dummies." The training continued for another hour, each scenario an opportunity for Sarah to critique, correct, or condescend. No matter how perfectly I performed, she found something wrong. Too aggressive, too gentle, too slow, too fast. The other staff members had long since stopped participating, content to watch the show as Sarah systematically dismantled my confidence piece by piece. But then, just as Sarah was preparing to deliver what I suspected would be her final devastating critique, the hospital's emergency alarm system crackled to life. The sound cut through the training room like a knife, sharp and urgent and unmistakably real. "Code Blue, Room 302. Code Blue, Room 302. All available personnel respond immediately." The room fell silent except for the continued blaring of the alarm. Sarah's face went pale beneath her makeup, and I watched as panic flickered across her features. Room 302 was just down the hall from where we were training, close enough that we could hear the commotion starting to build as medical staff rushed toward the emergency. "Well," Sarah said, her voice suddenly uncertain, "I suppose we should? I mean, we're in training, so we don't need to." But I was already moving toward the door, my heart racing with the familiar adrenaline rush that came with real emergencies. This wasn't a plastic mannequin with painted-on features and mechanical breathing. This was someone's life hanging in the balance, and every second of hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. "Where are you going?" Sarah called after me, but her voice sounded distant and irrelevant. Because for the first time since walking into St. Mary's Hospital, I knew exactly where I belonged and what I needed to do. The laughter and mockery from the break room seemed like a lifetime ago as I pushed through the training room doors and into the corridor, following the sound of the alarm toward whatever crisis awaited in room 302. The hallway stretched endlessly before me as I sprinted toward room 302, my sensible flat slapping against the polished linoleum with each urgent step. Behind me, I could hear Sarah and her crew hesitating, their voices a confused murmur of uncertainty and fear. But ahead, the chaos was building, nurses shouting orders, the crash cart's wheels squeaking frantically, and underneath it all, the terrible silence that meant someone wasn't breathing. I burst through the doorway of room 302 to find controlled pandemonium. An elderly man, probably in his 70s, lay motionless on the hospital bed while 2 nurses worked frantically around him. His gray hair was plastered to his sweaty forehead, and his lips had that bluish tinge that made my stomach drop. The cardiac monitor showed a flat line that stretched across the screen like a death sentence written in green light. "Where's the code team?" shouted Jenny Martinez, the charge nurse, her usually calm demeanor cracking under pressure. Her scrubs were already soaked with perspiration, and I could see her hands shaking as she prepared the defibrillator paddles. Dr. Peterson is in surgery, and Dr. Kim is with another emergency downstairs. I'm certified, I called out, pushing my way into the room past the confused HR staff who had finally caught up but were now hovering uselessly in the doorway. BLS, ACLS, and PALS current. What's the situation? Jenny looked at me with desperate relief, not caring that I was just the new intern who'd been getting mocked 20 minutes earlier. In emergencies, credentials mattered more than office politics, and right now she needed competent hands more than she needed hierarchy. 73-year-old male, admitted yesterday for chest pain observation. She rattled off while I moved to the bedside and immediately began checking for pulse and breathing. Found unresponsive by his daughter. No pulse, no respirations. Down for approximately 2 minutes before we got here. My training took over completely, every lesson from my EMT days flooding back as I positioned myself over the patient. His skin was cool and waxy under my fingers, but 2 minutes down meant we still had a fighting chance. The smell of hospital antiseptic mixed with a metallic scent of fear and adrenaline that always accompanied code blues. Starting compressions, I announced, interlocking my fingers and positioning them over the lower half of his sternum. The first compression sent a slight crack through his chest, ribs giving way under the pressure, which was normal and expected, though it always sounded horrifying to family members. 30 compressions, hard and fast, letting the chest recoil completely between each one. I could feel Sarah and her HR cronies watching from the doorway, their earlier mockery forgotten in the face of actual life and death action. 100 beats per minute, at least 2 inches deep, exactly like I'd practiced on countless mannequins and performed on real patients during my EMT rotations. Bag him, I called to Jenny, who immediately positioned the ambu bag over the patient's face and began providing rescue breaths. 2 breaths after every 30 compressions, watching for chest rise, maintaining that crucial rhythm that could mean the difference between brain death and recovery. The room fell into the familiar dance of emergency medicine, everyone knowing their role, moving with practiced efficiency despite the underlying panic. I could hear the patient's daughter crying in the hallway, being comforted by a chaplain who'd appeared from nowhere. The crash cart's monitor beeped steadily, documenting every compression and breath we delivered. How long has she been doing CPR? I heard Dr. Richardson's voice from the doorway. He was one of the senior attending physicians, someone whose opinion actually mattered in this hospital's complex hierarchy. His presence meant that word was already spreading about the new intern who'd taken charge of the code blue. 3 minutes of high-quality compressions, Jenny replied, never taking her focus off the ambu bag. She knew exactly what to do. Better technique than some residents I've worked with. I felt a flush of pride despite the gravity of the situation, but I kept my attention focused on the chest compressions. 15 compressions in, and I could feel fatigue starting to creep into my shoulders. CPR was exhausting work, especially when done correctly, and I'd need someone to spell me soon if this continued much longer. Let me take over compressions, offered Mike Thompson, one of the ICU nurses who'd just arrived. He was built like a linebacker and could probably maintain compressions for hours without breaking a sweat. 30 more seconds, I replied, determined to complete the full 2-minute cycle before switching. Consistency was crucial in CPR, and changing providers mid-cycle could disrupt the rhythm that might restart this man's heart. As I continued compressions, I became aware of more people gathering in the doorway. Word had spread quickly through the hospital grapevine that the new intern, the one HR had been mocking during training, was running a code blue. I could see other nurses peeking in, along with a few residents and even some administrative staff who'd probably never seen real emergency medicine up close. Check rhythm, Dr. Richardson called out as my 2 minutes expired. I immediately stopped compressions and stepped back, allowing Mike to move into position while Jenny checked the monitor. The green line showed organized electrical activity, not perfect, but definitely better than the flat line we'd started with. Everyone held their breath as Jenny checked for a pulse, her fingers pressed against the carotid artery, while we all watched the monitor trace. "I've got a pulse," she announced, and the entire room seemed to exhale simultaneously. Weak but present. Blood pressure is coming up. The patient's color was already improving, that deadly blue tinge fading from his lips as oxygen began circulating through his system again. His eyelids fluttered slightly, and he made a small groaning sound that was the most beautiful noise I'd ever heard. We brought him back from the edge of death, and the feeling was better than any drug. "Outstanding work, everyone," Dr. Richardson said, his eyes meeting mine with unmistakable approval. "Especially you, miss?" "Jessica," I replied, still catching my breath from the adrenaline rush. "Jessica Torres. I'm the new intern in the emergency response program." "Well, Miss Torres, that was some of the best CPR I've seen from anyone at any level. You may have just saved this man's life." Behind Dr. Richardson, I could see Sarah Mitchell standing in the doorway with her mouth hanging open. The woman who'd spent an hour questioning my competence and mocking my appearance now looked like she'd seen a ghost. Her perfectly styled hair was slightly mussed, and there were stress sweat stains visible under the arms of her blazer. The other HR staff members clustered around her looked equally stunned. Maria Gonzalez, the assistant who'd looked uncomfortable during the earlier mockery, was staring at me with something that looked like awe. Even the administrative assistants who'd laughed at my youthful appearance seemed to be reevaluating their earlier judgments. "Dr. Richardson," Sarah finally found her voice, though it came out shakier than her usual confident tone. "I should mention that Jessica is still technically in her training period. We were just assessing her emergency response capabilities when the code blue was called." The look Dr. Richardson gave Sarah could have frozen Lake Michigan in July. His expression made it clear that he'd heard about the training session and wasn't impressed with what he'd learned. "Well, her emergency response capabilities seem to be exactly what we need around here," he said coldly. "I'll be sure to mention that in my report to administration." As the immediate crisis passed and the patient was stabilized for transfer to the ICU, I finally had a moment to process what had just happened. 20 minutes ago, I'd been standing in a break room being mocked for my appearance and questioned about my competence. Now I was receiving praise from one of the hospital's most respected physicians, while the same people who'd mocked me watched in stunned silence. But something in Sarah's expression told me this wasn't over. The humiliation I'd just put her through, inadvertently but publicly, would have consequences. In my experience, people like Sarah Mitchell didn't forget being shown up, especially not in front of their subordinates and superiors. As I helped clean up the code blue equipment and prepared to write my incident report, I caught Sarah's eye across the room. Her smile was back, but it was different now, colder and more calculating. It was the smile of someone planning revenge. Tell me in the comments what you think about workplace dynamics in healthcare. Have you ever witnessed someone rise to the occasion when others doubted them? Don't forget to subscribe for more real stories from the front lines of medicine. The next morning arrived with Chicago's typical November gloom, gray clouds pressing against the hospital windows like a suffocating blanket. I walked through the main entrance at 6:45 a.m., my badge still new enough to stick slightly when I swiped it at the security turnstiles. The overnight security guard, Marcus, gave me a knowing nod and a small smile that told me word about yesterday's code blue had already spread through the hospital's extensive gossip network. "Morning, hero," he said quietly, and I felt my cheeks warm with embarrassment. Hospital staff had a way of making legends out of routine medical procedures, but I appreciated the acknowledgement after yesterday's humiliation in the break room. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor felt different today. 2 nurses from the cardiac unit were discussing a patient case, and when they noticed me, their conversation shifted to compliments about my performance during the emergency. It was surreal hearing strangers talk about my CPR technique and decision-making like I was some kind of medical celebrity. But my brief moment of glory evaporated the second I walked into the HR department. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and conversation stopped mid-sentence when I appeared. Sarah Mitchell stood near the copy machine, surrounded by her usual circle of administrative assistants, but their body language was different from yesterday's casual mockery. Now they looked like conspirators planning something sinister. "Well, if it isn't our little lifesaver," Sarah announced, her voice dripping with fake sweetness that fooled absolutely no one. "I hope you're not expecting special treatment just because you got lucky during that emergency yesterday." The word lucky hit me like a slap across the face. Luck had nothing to do with the years of training, the countless hours of certification courses, or the muscle memory that had kicked in when someone's life was on the line. But arguing with Sarah in front of her audience would only give her more ammunition to use against me. "I'm just here to do my job," I replied, settling into my assigned desk in the corner of the open office space. The desk was positioned strategically so that Sarah could monitor my every move while maintaining plausible deniability about micromanaging the new intern. "Of course you are, sweetie," Sarah continued, her tone becoming more condescending with each word. "But I think we need to have a serious discussion about proper protocols and chain of command. You can't just go running off to medical emergencies without proper authorization from your supervisor." My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. Was she seriously suggesting that I should have asked permission before responding to a code blue? The absurdity of it was so complete that I wondered if this was some kind of elaborate joke. But the expressions on the faces around me made it clear that Sarah was deadly serious. "Code blues are all-hands emergencies," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice professional despite the anger building in my chest. "Every certified person is expected to respond if they're available and qualified. Not interns," Sarah shot back, her voice gaining volume and authority. "Interns observe and learn. They don't take charge of medical emergencies without direct supervision from senior staff. What you did yesterday was reckless and potentially dangerous." The room fell silent except for the distant hum of the hospital's ventilation system and the occasional beep from someone's computer. I could feel every pair of eyes in the office watching this confrontation, waiting to see how I would respond to Sarah's increasingly desperate attempt to reassert her authority. Before I could formulate a response, my desk phone rang with the sharp electronic chirp that had become the soundtrack of hospital life. The caller ID showed an internal extension from the chief medical officer's office, and I felt my stomach do a small flip as I answered. "Jessica Torres speaking." "Miss Torres, this is Dr. Margaret Chen's office. Dr. Chen would like to see you in her office at 10 a.m. this morning. Are you available?" I glanced at Sarah, whose face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. Dr. Chen was the chief medical officer, the person who ultimately made decisions about medical staff and emergency protocols. Being summoned to her office could mean anything from a commendation to a disciplinary action, and there was no way to tell which until I got there. "Yes, I'll be there," I replied, hanging up the phone and immediately feeling the weight of everyone's stares. "Well," Sarah said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic, "I suppose we'll find out what the administration really thinks about your little performance yesterday." But her confidence was cracking, and everyone in the room could see it. The woman who'd been so certain of her authority yesterday was now facing the possibility that her public humiliation of the new intern might have consequences. Dr. Chen wasn't known for tolerating incompetence or unprofessional behavior, especially when it interfered with patient care. The next 3 hours crawled by like a slow-motion nightmare. Sarah alternated between making snide comments about proper procedures and shooting nervous glances at her computer screen, probably researching hospital policies about emergency response protocols. Her assistants whispered among themselves, creating a constant background buzz of speculation and gossip. At 9:45 a.m., I walked through the hospital's administrative wing toward Dr. Chen's office, my heels clicking against marble floors that cost more than most people's cars. The executive level had a different feel from the rest of the hospital. Less antiseptic, more corporate, with expensive artwork and fresh flowers that someone probably replaced weekly. Dr. Chen's secretary, a dignified woman in her 60s, smiled warmly and gestured toward the office door. "She's waiting for you, dear. Go right in." Dr. Margaret Chen was legendary at St. Mary's, a cardiovascular surgeon who transitioned to administration but maintained her reputation as someone who didn't tolerate nonsense from anyone. She looked up from her computer as I entered, her expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses that had probably witnessed more hospital drama than anyone should have to endure. "Please, sit down, Miss Torres," she said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs facing her massive mahogany desk. "I wanted to discuss yesterday's incident in room 302. My heart hammered against my ribs as I settled into the chair, trying to read her expression for any hint of what was coming. The office was silent except for the soft tick of an antique clock on the bookshelf and the distant sounds of Chicago traffic 40 floors below. "Dr. Richardson filed a very interesting report about your performance during the Code Blue," Dr. Chen continued, opening a manila folder on her desk. "He was quite impressed with your technique and decision-making under pressure." Relief flooded through me like warm honey, but I kept my expression neutral. In hospital politics, premature celebration could be dangerous, and I'd learned not to trust good news until it was completely delivered and confirmed. However, Dr. Chin continued, and my relief immediately curdled into anxiety. I've also received some interesting feedback from your HR supervisor about concerns regarding protocol adherence and proper chain of command. The way she said, interesting feedback, made it clear that she wasn't taking Sarah's complaints seriously, but the fact that they'd reached the CMO's desk at all was troubling. Sarah had apparently decided that the best defense was a good offense, filing formal complaints to cover her own embarrassment. I'd like to hear your perspective on what happened, Dr. Chin said, leaning back in her chair with the patient expression of someone who'd been dealing with hospital politics for decades. Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out. I took a deep breath and began recounting the events from the training session, Sarah's mockery, and the subsequent emergency response. Dr. Chen listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in the folder, her expression growing more interested as I described the HR department's reaction during the crisis. So let me understand this correctly, Dr. Chen said when I finished. During your emergency response training, your supervisor questioned your competence and suggested you weren't qualified to handle real emergencies. Then, when a real emergency occurred, she hesitated to respond while you immediately took appropriate action. Yes, ma'am, I replied, grateful that she seemed to understand the irony of the situation. Dr. Chin closed the folder and removed her glasses, cleaning them with deliberate care while she processed what I told her. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the soft whoosh of the building's air circulation system and the distant sound of a helicopter landing on the hospital's roof helipad. Miss Torres, she finally said, replacing her glasses and meeting my eyes directly. I've been running hospitals for 23 years, and I've seen every kind of personality conflict, power struggle, and bureaucratic nonsense you can imagine. What I'm hearing from you sounds remarkably similar to other complaints I've been receiving about certain supervisory practices in the HR department. My pulse quickened. Other complaints that suggested Sarah's behavior toward me wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern that had caught administration's attention. I want you to know that your actions yesterday were exemplary, Dr. Chin continued. You followed proper emergency protocols, demonstrated excellent clinical skills, and quite possibly saved a man's life. That's exactly the kind of initiative and competence we want to see from our staff at every level. The validation felt better than any drug, washing away the lingering sting of yesterday's humiliation and this morning's passive-aggressive attacks. But something in Dr. Chen's expression suggested there was more to this conversation than simple praise for a job well done. There's something else we need to discuss, she said, opening another folder that had been sitting on her desk. We're conducting a comprehensive review of our HR department's hiring and training practices, and I'd like you to be part of that process. The implications hit me like a freight train. A comprehensive review meant investigation, audits, and potentially massive changes in personnel. Sarah's attempt to discredit me had apparently backfired spectacularly, drawing attention to problems that administration was already aware of but hadn't yet addressed. But I also knew that agreeing to participate in such a review would make me a permanent enemy of Sarah Mitchell and anyone else who might be implicated in whatever they uncovered. Hospital politics could be vicious, and retaliation was a real possibility. Dr. Chin seemed to read my hesitation. I know this puts you in a difficult position, Miss Torres, but sometimes doing the right thing requires courage, and yesterday you demonstrated that you have plenty of that. As I walked back toward the HR department, my head spinning with the implications of everything Dr. Chen had told me, I had no idea that I was about to discover just how deep Sarah's problems ran and how desperate she was becoming to protect whatever secrets she'd been hiding. You won't believe what happens next. The real story behind HR's dysfunction was darker than anyone imagined. Make sure you're subscribed because this gets intense. The elevator doors opened on the third floor with their familiar mechanical ding, but something felt different as I stepped back into the HR department. The usual chatter had been replaced by hushed whispers and nervous glances, creating an atmosphere thick with tension and barely suppressed panic. Sarah Mitchell stood at her desk, frantically shuffling through papers, her normally perfect composure cracking like thin ice under pressure. There she is, Sarah announced as I walked to my desk, her voice carrying a shrill edge that made several people look up from their computers. our little whistleblower. I hope you're proud of yourself for running straight to administration with your complaints." The accusation hung in the air like toxic smoke, but before I could respond, Maria Gonzalez appeared at my elbow with a manila envelope in her trembling hands. Her face was pale, and she kept glancing nervously towards Sarah's office as if afraid of being overheard. "Jessica," she whispered, pressing the envelope into my hands, "you need to see this. I found it when I was updating personnel files this morning. Sarah told me to shred everything older than 5 years, but I thought you should know what's in there first." My fingers fumbled with the envelope clasp, and what I found inside made my blood run cold. Copies of hiring documents, certification records, and background checks, all bearing Sarah's signature and approval. But as I flipped through the pages, a horrifying pattern emerged. Fake nursing licenses, expired CPR certifications, forged medical school transcripts, and background checks that had obviously been altered to hide criminal records and disciplinary actions. "My God," I breathed, staring at a hiring packet for someone named Jennifer Walsh, whose RN license had expired 3 years ago but who was currently working in the ICU. "How many people are working here with fake credentials?" "At least 15 that I've found so far," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise of computers and air conditioning. "Maybe more. Sarah's been covering it up for years, approving people who shouldn't be anywhere near patients. She told me it was just administrative errors, but now the implications crashed over me like a tsunami. Unqualified nurses administering medications, unlicensed technicians operating medical equipment, fake doctors making life and death decisions. Every patient in this hospital was potentially at risk because Sarah Mitchell had been running a hiring scheme that prioritized convenience over competence. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Because yesterday, when you saved that man's life, I realized what real competence looks like," Maria replied, tears forming in her eyes. "And I've been helping cover up for people who don't have it. If someone dies because I stayed quiet, I'll never forgive myself." Sarah's voice suddenly cut through our whispered conversation like a knife through silk. "Maria, get over here. Now." We both froze like deer caught in headlights. Sarah was standing in her office doorway, her face flushed with anger and her hands clenched into fists. She'd obviously noticed our conversation and was putting 2 and 2 together about what Maria might be sharing. "I need to speak with you privately," Sarah said to Maria, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Right now." As Maria reluctantly walked toward Sarah's office, I quickly slipped the envelope into my desk drawer and tried to look busy with mundane paperwork. But my mind was racing, processing the magnitude of what I'd just discovered. This wasn't just about Sarah's wounded ego or petty workplace politics. This was criminal negligence on a massive scale, and people could die because of it. Through the glass walls of Sarah's office, I could see an intense conversation taking place. Sarah was gesturing wildly, her voice rising despite the closed door, while Maria sat hunched in her chair looking increasingly distressed. Other staff members were pretending to work while obviously straining to overhear whatever drama was unfolding. 20 minutes later, Maria emerged from the office looking like she'd seen a ghost. Her face was streaked with tears, and her hands were shaking as she gathered her personal belongings from her desk. Sarah followed close behind, her expression triumphant and cold. "Maria has decided to resign, effective immediately," Sarah announced to the office with fake sympathy dripping from every word. "Personal family issues require her immediate attention. We wish her all the best in her future endeavors." Maria caught my eye as she walked past my desk toward the elevator, and I saw the fear there. She mouthed the word, "careful," so quietly that I almost missed it, then disappeared behind the closing elevator doors. Whatever Sarah had said to her in that office had been enough to scare her into silence and flight. But Sarah had made a critical error. In her desperation to contain the damage, she'd acted too quickly and too obviously. Firing the person who'd been helping expose her corruption only made her look more guilty, and several other staff members had noticed the suspicious timing. "That was weird," commented Janet Wilson, one of the senior administrative assistants who'd been with the hospital for over a decade. "Maria seemed fine this morning, and then suddenly she's having family emergencies. People quit all the time," Sarah replied tersely, but I caught the nervous tremor in her voice. "Now everyone back to work. We have hiring packets to process. The irony of that statement would have been funny if it weren't so terrifying. Sarah was still processing hiring packets, still approving unqualified candidates, still putting patient lives at risk even as her scheme was unraveling around her. But now I had evidence, and I had a moral obligation to act on it. During my lunch break, I made copies of everything Maria had given me, storing the originals in my car and the copies in my apartment. Then I called Dr. Chen's office and requested an urgent meeting, explaining that I had additional information relevant to the HR department review she'd mentioned. Dr. Chen can see you at 3 p.m. today, her secretary informed me. She's cleared her calendar for this discussion. The rest of the afternoon crawled by like a prison sentence. Sarah kept shooting suspicious glances in my direction, clearly wondering what had transpired between Maria and me before her hasty resignation. Her paranoia was becoming more obvious by the hour, manifesting in increasingly erratic behavior that was drawing attention from other departments. At 2:45 p.m., I gathered my courage and the damning evidence and headed back to the executive floor. This time, Dr. Chen's office felt less intimidating and more like a sanctuary where justice might finally be served. But I knew that once I handed over those documents, there would be no going back. Sarah Mitchell's career would be over, and mine at St. Mary's might be, as well if she had allies I didn't know about. Dr. Chen took one look at my face and immediately understood that this wasn't a routine follow-up meeting. "What do you have for me, Miss Torres?" I placed the envelope on her desk and watched her expression change as she examined the contents. Her professional composure never wavered, but I could see the anger building behind her eyes as she realized the scope of what she was looking at. "How long has this been going on?" she asked quietly, her voice deadly calm in the way that hospital administrators perfected when dealing with catastrophic situations. "Based on the dates on these documents, at least 5 years," I replied. "Maybe longer. Maria said there could be more people with falsified credentials that she hasn't found yet." Dr. Chen closed the envelope and reached for her phone, pressing a speed dial number that I suspected connected directly to hospital security or legal counsel. "We need to initiate an immediate investigation and audit of all HR hiring practices for the past decade. And I want security stationed outside the HR department to prevent any document destruction." As she spoke, I realized that my life at St. Mary's Hospital was about to change dramatically. Within hours, investigators would be swarming through the HR department, auditing files, interviewing staff, and unraveling years of corruption. Sarah Mitchell's reign of incompetence was finally coming to an end, but the consequences would ripple through the entire hospital. When Dr. Chen finished her call, she turned back to me with an expression of grim determination. "Miss Torres, you've potentially saved countless lives by bringing this forward. But I need to warn you that the next few weeks are going to be extremely difficult. There will be investigations, depositions, and possibly criminal charges. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about the elderly man whose life I'd saved during the Code Blue, about all the patients who were currently being treated by unqualified staff, about Maria's frightened face as she fled the building. The choice was clear, even if the consequences were uncertain. "I'm prepared," I said and meant it. But as I walked back toward the HR department for what I suspected might be the last time as a regular employee, I had no idea that Sarah's desperation was about to reach dangerous new levels. The woman who'd mocked my competence was now cornered like a rabid animal, and cornered animals were capable of anything. The security guards were already stationed outside the HR department when I returned from Dr. Chen's office, their presence sending shockwaves through the 3rd floor. Sarah Mitchell stood frozen at her desk, watching in horror as investigators in dark suits began systematically boxing up files and hard drives. Her perfect facade had finally crumbled completely, revealing the desperate woman underneath who'd built her career on lies and deception. "This is all your fault," she hissed as I walked past her desk, her voice filled with venom and panic. "You have no idea what you've done. This hospital will be ruined because of your pathetic need for attention." But her threats felt empty now, the words of someone who'd already lost everything and was lashing out in her final moments of power. Around us, other HR staff members were being interviewed by investigators, some crying as they realized their own careers might be over if they'd been complicit in the hiring fraud. Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway flanked by 2 investigators and the hospital's legal counsel. Her expression was grimmer than I'd ever seen it, the weight of the crisis settling on her shoulders like a heavy coat. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone making life-changing decisions. "Sarah Mitchell, you're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation into hiring practices and credential verification. Security will escort you from the building." The color drained from Sarah's face as the reality hit her. 20 years of climbing the hospital hierarchy, building her reputation, accumulating power, all of it was disintegrating in real time. She grabbed her purse with shaking hands, her earlier confidence replaced by the desperate movements of someone whose world was collapsing. "You can't do this," she stammered, looking around the room for support that wasn't coming. "I've given my life to this hospital. One mistake doesn't erase decades of service. 15 unqualified staff members isn't one mistake," Dr. Chin replied coldly. "It's systematic negligence that put patient lives at risk. We've already identified 3 cases where medication errors occurred because unlicensed personnel were making clinical decisions they weren't qualified to make." As security escorted Sarah toward the elevator, she turned back one final time, her eyes finding mine across the chaotic department. The look she gave me was pure hatred, promising that this wasn't over even though we both knew her career was finished. The elevator doors closed on her perfectly styled hair and designer suit, taking her away from St. Mary's forever. Over the next 3 weeks, the investigation expanded beyond anyone's worst expectations. 22 staff members were found to have falsified credentials, ranging from expired certifications to completely fabricated medical degrees. The scandal made national news, with reporters camping outside the hospital and interviewing families of patients who might have been affected by the unqualified staff. But something positive emerged from the chaos. Dr. Chen implemented new verification systems that would prevent future hiring fraud, and she personally oversaw the recruitment of qualified replacements for every position that had been compromised. The hospital's reputation took a hit initially, but the transparency of their response actually strengthened public trust in the long run. As for me, I was promoted to Assistant Director of Quality Assurance, with responsibility for ensuring that all clinical staff maintained proper certifications and training. It was ironic that the woman who'd mocked my qualifications had inadvertently launched my career to heights I'd never imagined possible. 6 months later, I received a letter from the elderly man whose life I'd saved during that first code blue. He'd made a full recovery and wanted to thank the young woman who'd refused to let him die when others hesitated. Reading his words, I realized that everything I'd endured, the mockery, the investigation, the threats, had been worth it for that one moment when training overcame fear and competence triumphed over corruption. Sarah Mitchell was eventually convicted of fraud and conspiracy, receiving a 2-year prison sentence and lifetime ban from healthcare employment. Maria Gonzalez testified against her former boss and was granted immunity in exchange for her cooperation. She now works at a community clinic, helping ensure that qualified nurses provide care to underserved populations. Sometimes the people who doubt you the most are the ones who reveal your greatest strengths. Sarah's laughter in that break room had stung, but it also motivated me to prove that competence speaks louder than mockery, that doing the right thing matters more than avoiding conflict, and that sometimes the youngest person in the room might be the most qualified to handle the crisis everyone else is too afraid to face. Looking back, I realized that Sarah's mockery was never really about my age or appearance. It was about her own insecurity and fear of being exposed. She saw competence as a threat because she knew her own was built on lies. But in trying to diminish me, she only highlighted the very qualities that would ultimately save lives and expose the truth. What do you think about standing up against corruption in high-stakes environments like hospitals? Have you ever had to choose between staying silent and doing what's right, even when it put your own position at risk? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more real stories from the front lines of healthcare where courage makes all the difference.